Tēnā koutou katoa. Nau mai hara mai ki E Hika. Nau mai hara mai ki a koutou e ngā whānau whānui, nau mai ki te hōtaka mai. Nō reira, tēnā rā koutou katoa. Ko hiri ni kātoki unga, he uri no te tai rāwhiti, he honore mōku ki te mihi atu ki a koutou. Welcome to E Hika, and today we have a very, very special guest. We have Reverend Dr. George Armstrong. Activist, theologian, thinker, doer, troublemaker, all of the above. And it's a great honour and pleasure to have him here today on our show as we think about the deeper things in life, the purpose of life. No pressure, George, but if you could come up with some answers for us, that'd be great. So, kia ora, George, welcome. Welcome to E Hika, welcome to our show today, and it's such a pleasure to have you here as well. So, kia ora, George. Yeah.
Oh, kia ora. Thank you for the welcome. And it's just great to be here talking with you.
Kia ora, yes. Yeah. It's an honour for me, George. I've known you my whole life, I'm pretty sure, and we've got connections through... I've been getting my cousins on so far, and you're a whānau connection too, and a long way from my mother's Pākehā side as well. So, yeah. So it's lovely to have you here today as well, George. Yes, and you knew my father well, yes, we've had a long family connection, and I've grown up admiring you, knowing of you. You've been a presence in my life, and in some ways I'd say you've been an inspiration in my life too. You're the when I think about you, I think about what it means to be Anglican in its fullness, if that's not too much, with your expression of faith, your active expression of our faith, and your constant quest for justice. So thank you, George. It's an honour to have you here today as well. So if you don't mind, you started off, you're born in Dunedin and had from some accounts you've given to people, had a relatively privileged, happy, upbringing and enjoyed life and cubs and things, and this kind of, flowed into the Anglican Church. And why, you could have gone on to be and this isn't really a criticism, but you could have been like so many of your peers and just kind of blended into New Zealand society as it was at the time, which, from a Māori perspective, wasn't the best. It was pretty racist, pretty unjust, pretty unfair. Instead, you didn't. Why did you pick another path? What inspired you to head towards justice?
I've thought a lot about this myself. I think I came out of the womb that way. and I've never been any different. And I was quite a trial to my mother, who was a wonderful woman, I must say. I think about her a lot now. Although she had the slenderest of means, my dad was a working class fellow who'd been in the 1914-18 war and come back pretty battered and was nursed by my mother, and eventually they gave birth to my eldest brother, who was quite a bit older than me. But my mother brought to the marriage a certain amount of material wealth from the fact that her father and mother were pretty upper middle class, and that is my grandfather on my mother's side. He was a very senior person in the New Zealand Railways, which was like being in a high position in Air New Zealand nowadays, really, or in the space race or something. And so he had and he was great. He very upstanding, upright man, and he shared his gravitas and some of his wealth. He and his wife shared that with my mother, and she used that very carefully through our life as a fairly working class family, but she always made sure we had a warm, dry house to live in, and she made sure my dad had a car to drive around in, and made sure he was located near a pub, so he could get there in time before the 6 o'clock closing time. And my father was a great fellow too. He'd worn himself out on trying to discipline his two oldest boys, who were a real tearaway pair, almost impossible to control if I look at it from my point of view. My dad only knew how to follow the idea of spare the rod and spoil the child, and my mother rather agreed. So my eldest two brothers ended up, I think, with no love for their father. It was a terrible thing. It's grieved me greatly ever since whenever I think of it. And the same happened with the third brother I have, who was not such a tearaway, or he was a tearaway in a different form. They're all fascinating, those brothers. They're all dead now. And my brother married a Jewish woman eventually in England, and she was a fascinating person. So, all of those immediate whānau connections, I've learned an enormous amount, probably the main amount, to strengthen what I brought with me from the womb. And I, being the youngest and the baby in the family, I got all the cream, really, and they got the milk if they were lucky. But also it left me rather lonely, except I had a wonderful young woman who was my sister, 2 years older than me. She spoilt me rotten, but I was always lonely because I was just very much younger than my brothers. All their minds were on warfare. It was the 39-45 war. I was born in 31, and so I was only 8 years old when war was declared. And from the moment that war was declared, I dreamed of flying Spitfires. And every night without fail, I would lie in my bed and dream of climbing into a Spitfire and tearing off into the clouds and taking on the Messerschmitts.
Whereas really they didn't live long, the Spitfire pilots.
Oh, no. Yeah. I was too young because I was in high school from 44 to 49, 1944 to 49. So that explains some of it. I found the world, the world that I received, the culture that I received, I found it boring, mostly. And I found the academic world boring, although I was quite good at it. And I could have done much better. I could have got a first class honours instead of a second class, which was, Jocelyn, my wife's got a first class honours. But I made up for it later on.
Well, George, Jocelyn is cleverer than you. We know, everyone knows this.
And she's completely different from me.
Yeah.
And that's made up for a marvellous marriage.
Well, I'm fascinated, George, because, you're not kind of ascribing your search to justice to like what we might call a whiteboard experience. You didn't learn it from some book necessarily. You didn't learn it in the classroom. You just kind of learnt it from living and your observations of life, and that's a beautiful thing because, anyone should be able to do that. It wasn't your eyes weren't opened by some particular teacher or book necessarily. And yet you did go on to Princeton, right, to do your PhD.
Yes, and I would rather have gone to New York or Boston or San Francisco because I knew Princeton was although it was in a real Ivy League place and had a tremendous reputation, it was boring too. they kept their noses clean there.
What bored you about academia? Like, when you say boring, what do you mean by that?
Well, they had a standard curriculum, and they had a standard way of studying for the curriculum. And even though I was enrolled for the doctoral studies at Princeton and I had access to the university classes, all the top-level stuff, as well as the seminary, what bored me was the liberal tradition actually bored me, because I could see that it was failing too, although I was very much a liberal sort of person, although I had a lot of the evangelical in me as well. But what bored me, it was all set and fixed, and even in Princeton, which was pretty good. It was very good. When I went into my first meeting with the person they'd assigned to me as advisor, without consulting me, by the way, he just gave me a list of books a mile long, and he said, well, your first job is to read all these. And I was struck dumb, really, and I went out thinking, if this is what's going to happen to me, I'm going to have to resign my scholarship and go straight back home. But so I could see I couldn't survive under this advisor, or perhaps I managed to convert him, but I didn't think so. So I went and looked around for someone else and found the best kind of theological missionary theologian he was, who'd been kicked out of Brazil by the military junta, and he'd been invited straight away to come and teach at Princeton Seminary by his mutual friend. His friend was the head of the seminary, and they shared the same birthday. And I gradually got to know the head of the seminary, and the amazing guy, and his name was Richard Shaw, and he was fabulous, and he was right at the centre of the whole liberation movement within the Americas, and he was with it from, I gradually realised that he had a sense of the special value of the indigenous people in Latin America, and he never developed that exactly, but he had that, and he had an enormous respect for wherever he felt, he saw, felt, smelt the gospel being lived out.
So this radical side of you, George, and by that I mean the ability to think outside of the usual framing, to not follow the pack necessarily. I mean, you get sent to Princeton and your first thought is, this is nonsense. I mean, I'd say 99% of people who get there are just so overwhelmed and so, they just follow along. Whereas you're thinking, this is rubbish. Like it's amazing. Like it's a quality you seem to exhibit through your whole life. Not diminishing Princeton, but just questioning. Why are we doing it this way? There are better ways than this. So you come across liberation theology. Could you share, for those at home who aren't that familiar, what is liberation theology? What's at the heart of it?
What's at the heart of it is, in a sense, taking the Exodus seriously in the Christian religious and the Jewish religious tradition, that a whole people could actually be liberated from virtual slavery, and that's the situation the Hebrew people found themselves in. And they got out of there. They had a great leader who risked his life and who took on the Pharaoh and understood himself to be assisted and delivered from birth onwards, and to lead his people, who were basically the working class, the poor class, the enslaved class, living around the River Nile and doing all the dirty work for the Egyptians, who had a really classy society going, and pursued by the army to get across the Red Sea and up through into Palestine. And that Exodus story was repeated later in their own history. They of course became colonisers themselves, and made a very destructive entry, according to their records, into Palestine. But that whole exodus and the possibility for an enslaved people to become free, I think that was at the heart of liberation theology. But it was very elegantly understood against the backdrop of their actual situation in the various Latino situations. Very elegantly understood. And Dick watched it all developing, and he was able to help in the publication of all of the key texts because he had good connections back. He was a sort of a useful Pākehā to the locals, and he gradually was realising that there was something special about the indigenous part, because of course all those Latin countries, that they'd been colonised by Spain and Portugal, and the whole thing got more and more complicated the more you looked at it.
So you were questioning this liberal theology you encountered, but then this liberation theology, you found in it something you could really grasp onto and consider.
Yes, the liberal theology was developed with Karl Marx and company and the interaction of the nation states in Europe. And Europe knew about liberation theology, but it tried to colonise it. And so there was a fascinating sort of thing. And in Asia knew about liberation theology, and they said, oh, that's Latin America, we're special here, we've got our own theology. So they developed their own theology, which was very interesting. But neither of them really reached into the roots of the human race that exist for us globally in indigenous communities. That's what they didn't get back into that. Although someone like Dick Shaw sort of knew it instinctively when he came across it. He knew he was in touch with something that was phenomenal and not getting starry-eyed about anything.
So I mean, from where we're sitting in 2025, and, you've got things like, nations' declarations on the rights of Indigenous people. You've got things like COP, where there's a more pronounced Indigenous presence. You're thinking, if they'd been able to grasp that more at the time, it would have been more effective still, potentially.
Well, it takes time. And I can understand it taking time. It's taken a long time to get to be as old as I am. And I'm a slow learner, I think. But once I've learned something, I never forget it. And once I learn it, I've usually learned it by hard, painful experience, because I haven't included the main reason why I am what I am, because I can come from, dated precisely 1968, the Good Friday procession of the Anglican Church up Queen Street. And Eric Gowing, the bishop, he and I were good friends, both before and after, because it was a sort of, in some ways, a disaster what happened, because we took placards down into the procession saying Christ died for the Viet Cong, Christ died for Anzacs, Christ talks peace and all this sort of thing, because it was the height of the Vietnam War. And as soon as, and I didn't think there was any problem with that. I was so simple-minded. As only as we got nearer to where the procession was assembling down on the waterfront there, that I realised that we might not be welcome. And boy, we were not welcome. And poor old Eric, the bishop, was up the front with his leading lay people and stuff, and they were all saying, you have to get rid of those people at the back, get rid of those placards at the very least. So Eric came down and tried to remonstrate with us, and I thought, oh, good, I hadn't anticipated having to deal with this. And so I said to him, well, Eric, you know, I've got to carry on with this, but the students decide for themselves. You'll have to talk to them. So I forced him to talk directly to some of the students, and some of them pulled out, but a good number of them stayed on. And I had agreed that we would keep a bit of a distance between the main procession and ourselves, but the traffic police forced us to close up because they didn't understand that we had this ecclesial deal. Mm-hmm. And as we turned into Queen Street, we went straight into the face of the television cameras. Mm-hmm. So Jocelyn, watching at home, saw all this happen. When I got home, I had to face the music, you know. But it was very funny. But you know, I realised that we were being completely rejected because the bishop asked the police to remove us from the procession, that we did not belong. And so we were, it was all a bit confused, but I realised this was a big rejection. And it was on the front page of the Herald, you know, that these theological students had been rebellious and were they going to be disciplined and this and that. They didn't, cleverly, they didn't mention that I was a member of the faculty, of course, and we'd had 2 or 3 hours discussion before the procession, and the Good Friday, you know, the Good Friday 12 to 3, noon to 3, the hours on the cross that Jesus is supposed to have spent and did possibly spend just like that. So we spent it talking together about the church, and that's what, there's so much energy built up in that 3 hours that it needed to go somewhere. And so we trotted off to that procession. And I went and talked with Eric afterwards. And Eric really, I realised thinking lately, Eric was he was always against the Vietnam War very publicly. So he's magnificent himself. But somehow he couldn't see, he couldn't see the shape of what was happening there at the time. I think he probably saw it afterwards because things that I drafted, which were quite strong at the time, drafted for the church, Eric always was quite happy with what I said.
So, and Christ died for the Viet Cong. So I think, you know, again, George, I think one of the characteristics of your ministry and the mission over the years has been, you know, again, your ability to see things other people haven't been able to see, to see the need, but also, and the way to get there, but also, you know, like you're saying, this bigger picture. So, and another example would be the Peace Squadron to Mururoa, to go and protest the French nuclear testing at Mururoa, the anti-apartheid movement, the Springbok Tour movement, 81. So you've been, you know, leading these, you know, having a theological lens that others haven't necessarily had, and taking the lead there. But in the meantime, back to this kind of indigenous space, you know, lots of people were activated around the Springbok Tour, but, you know, one of the dimensions of that was, where are Māori in this? You know, like, all good talking about apartheid in South Africa, but what are we doing here in Aotearoa? And you immersed yourself in that wānanga as well. And so you want to tell a little bit about, you know, your how you kind of became engaged with Māori, and, you know, what was your entry into that kind of Māori world of activism? And
yeah, well, at my high school there was one Maori pupil and 500 students, and I was quite conscious of him, and I was quite conscious of the kike down at the end of the peninsula in Otago, and I was interested. I was always more interested in the non-Pākehā than in the Pākehā. Not very deliberately, but it's just what I was. I used to go to the Chinese shop in Frederick Street, and I'd go behind the shop and see what they were up to, because two Chinese boys were in my Boy Scout troop, and I was the scoutmaster. And then I went over and had a look at their farm, their vegetable farm over in Waitati across the mountain on them, and I got to know that. And of course, Mao was on the rise too, and so I was sort of becoming aware of some of the dynamics, but they didn't touch my life so much at that stage. But now, somewhat this is related to your question, because when I got into the idea that protest was going to really alienate the church, my church, and I thought I've just got to get used to this because that's the way it is. And when we got back to college after the event, no one said a single word to me. None of the students, none of the faculty, not the warden, none of them. And I think with the warden, we called him the warden, just like a prison really. and the warden was the same guy that invited me to college because I asked questions, but my questions were too tough for him. And I began to realise I'm out of gear with the church as it is. I don't know how the church might be a bit more like what I think it should be, although what I realised, I thought at the time, I'm a bit too extreme on this, I thought the only way I really learned what Christianity was to practice Christianity, to do the sorts of things that Jesus said, to take his yoke upon me and learn from him, reading the New Testament or what. And Jesus said, he said to his disciples who weren't at all enthusiastic about this, Jesus was saying to them, you might be sort of half worshipping me, but don't imagine that you're going to have to be anything but like me and work with me in redeeming the world. You've got to take my yoke upon you. And he was talking about a double yoke. And Jesus says, my burden is easy and my burden is easy and my yoke light. It might have been the other way around. But what he was saying was, you've got a hell of a job in front of you if you want to really be my disciples. But when you start to do it, you'll understand what it's all about, and you'll find there's a burden, all right, but you can cope with it. And I'm there, and you're there, and we'll do it together, and you'll find that the yoke is the most comfortable thing. And I know I've experienced carrying 2 kerosene tins full of water with a yoke, on my own. And I was amazed how easy it was, because the yoke, I began to realise that the metaphor of the yoke was a beautiful description of it was happening to me anyway. It's not that I felt religiously closer to Jesus or anything like that, but I felt I was on the same track. Yeah.
And that's because you were saying before you described yourself as having this evangelical kind of approach. Is that what you're describing?
No, I had an evangelical, a sort of a normal, if you can call it normal, evangelical experience when I was about 21.
Right.
And that changed me religiously. I became very religious. you know, and when you got converted within the standard evangelical setting, when you got converted, you had to tell everybody else about it. That was part of the deal. So I went home and told my mum and dad. I turned off the radio. And Mum was very pleased. She and I were very close, really. But Dad said, "Oh, I thought you were religious enough already." So I went on to there to tell the vicar and the others. And he was an Anglican missioner who actually preached the gospel and got me. And even he was sort of slightly disconcerted by my enthusiasm. I wanted to go the whole hog. I wanted to give my life to Jesus, you know, and I hoped it would work, you know, but I wasn't doubting it. And so the next day, after I'd sort of gone through, I was pretty sure I'd had what the evangelicals call a conversion. And I was pretty sure, because it really did change my life from then on. But later on, I had the second conversion, which really, the one I was describing of the Good Friday procession, that was a sort of second conversion, because it really, you know.
How did the two interact? You know, how would you describe the interaction between your two conversions? Did one replace the other? Did one fuel the other? Just wondering if you got any thoughts about that.
Well, they sort of integrated themselves somehow. I've not thought about that question. But, of course, what was happening at the beginning of the 1970s, and the Good Friday procession had been 68, and then we'd been to Princeton for 3 years. When I got back, people were pretty much into liberation. The 60s had done their work. And when I came back, Norman Kirk was Prime Minister, and he was an extraordinary guy. He's like David Longy after him. And so, yeah, nothing had changed for, but it was the American experience was fantastic, really, in the long run. It was very helpful. But through that period, what was happening was you had the charismatic movement where the Holy Spirit fell on people and they kind of went into tongues and all sorts of stuff. And that came to the college fairly quickly. And this was, I could see, you know, the power of this was reaching people. And of course, that whole charismatic movement became a very strong, well-organised movement with its own curriculum and its own formal procedure. And now we've got a book describing that, what happened. And it was pretty clear to us liberals, or liberal evangelicals, whatever you like to call them, it was pretty clear to us that this charismatic movement didn't have substance somehow. It had lots of enthusiasm, huge amount of criticism of us liberals and wanting us to join up, or more or less saying we're going to take over the church, which was a very deliberate plot of the charismatic movement. And so straight away it was a kiss of death to it as far as I was concerned. And what's the point of taking over the church? That's something much deeper than you're going to achieve by this. Although it moved an awful lot of people, it was very successful and very, very well organised. Don Batley was a good organiser, and he wrote the book. He called it No Way Back, and I don't quite know what he meant by that title yet, and I can't get him to talk about it.
All right.
because he was one of the people who supported me when we got kicked out of the Good Friday procession. And when I reminded him of it, and he said to me, "Oh, I'm different now." He said, I'm the point man for the charismatic movement. And I had to go away puzzling as to what the hell's a point man? You know, the metaphor didn't, it still doesn't, it still puzzles me. But there was the charismatics. Of course, the evangelicals got a huge kick out of saying we want to take Anglicanism away from the Liberals and form our own outfit. And so, you know, you've got a lot of that now. And of course that was fairly pathetic kind of thing, GAFCON and all that. It won't go very far either. Those two were attempts to get the church unhinged from its former place and get it hinged onto a different thing. But it didn't work, it won't work, it hasn't worked. But all of those belong together. We're still sort of all of it in it together, whether we sit light to the church or sit strong to the church. I mean, in a way, I sit very strong to the church in a funny sort of way, but I'm not prepared to. I mean, I always just ignored the procedures and the curriculum of the church if it seemed to me to be unjust, like the remarriage of divorced people. I just ignored that. I got into a bit of trouble as a result. And I was a bit foolish because I was young and I wasn't old enough to really realise the big, all the angles on it. But it was right anyway.
So you were talking about the second conversion and, you know, taking on the yoke and which, you know, to fully live as a Christian, you needed to fully take up your cross and follow Christ. And in so doing, you know, be with the oppressed, be with the marginalised. And so Māori, you know, you just start building these relationships with Māori. Like, I don't know, Honeka and other troublemakers and the Harawira whānau and others. So
yeah, that began with the Peace Squadron, which I get my dates a bit mixed up. When I knew for sure that the Springbok tour was going to happen, I thought, this is not going to be an easy business. I don't want to have a bar of it because I'll have to be involved in it. But the one good thing about it, it was the great liberal issue, South Africa. We knew all about it because you had some marvellous, basically European priests who helped. You know, well, that's what I saw. And you had someone like Alan Paton who wrote Cry the Beloved Country, and he could see that the country was a whole. I've just been reading it recently, that book. It's a gem, but it actually raises questions to my surprise. But then the whole movement of South Africans to live in New Zealand raises questions too. And when South Africans came here way back, while apartheid was so strong, one priest came here and we were sitting in my living room and he said to me, New Zealand's just like South Africa, you got racism here. And I was offended. I was greatly offended, of course not for very long, because I was always willing to learn once the thing really hit me. And when it happened, and I got with the Maori up the front of the crowd who were breaking into the field, I had to go with them. And that's not where I wanted to be. It was bloody dangerous, much more dangerous than the peace squadron, where you're out bombing about on the water, you usually had a few possibilities, provided you're a bit careful. But in fact, calling people together to be out on the harbour was a bit like calling disciples in a way, but had nothing to do with making yourself a squadron leader or something like that. Nothing to do about that. So I was always a spokesperson, and so the other delightful thing about that was it was a real church. I wasn't a priest. I was a spokesperson. I was there to help that movement develop in whatever way it would develop. And it was a bit rough, but not bad. It's partly because we were on the water. And Chris Tremulin had already gone off to Asia, so we were beginning to learn about Asia as well as Latin America. Oh, I was beginning to know, because Chris was magnificent. He sent back these details of what was happening in Asia. And he was such a shock to the Singapore government that was emerging that the ecumenical movement and its officers got kicked out of Singapore.
Yes, I remember.
So it was extraordinary. And by that time, Jocelyn was hooked into the CCA and would go off to Singapore and ride on the back of Chris's motorbike and be informed about what was happening according to Saint Chris in the CCA and its internal sort of pressures, as well as the wider Asian context, like what was happening in Singapore and later on what was happening in Hong Kong, of course.
And so you're on the front line of the Springbok tour and with people like Hone and others.
Oh, yeah. Well, that happened. It was, I don't know quite what the first moves were, but this little group of high school Maori kids who'd organised themselves together, Otara, of course, out at Otara. And somehow or other, they got me out there and I became a useful Pākehā, doing some of the chores, like, above all, budgeting. I hated budgeting, but here I was with them. And they'd already, of course, done all sorts of radical things, which I gradually began to realise. And they were high school kids, and they had the most amazing analysis of what was going on. And so I just soaked it all in. Whereas my own Pākehā tribe was busy having these structural analysis seminars, and we were learning about structures and unjust structures and all that, and very pleased with ourselves to be understanding society, but actually we still had to live it out, and that was how we were going to live it out, because we were the children or the grandchildren of the colonisers, and our prosperity still was built on those confiscations and stuff, and the warfare that Governor Gray deliberately took the country into on the model of what had happened in South Africa.
You've been studying structural analysis, you got like Philippe Franchette coming out, and yet you're finding real wisdom with these young people in Otara and living it out.
They did things, and they sought out eventually their fellow Indigenous, because what happened was Titiwhai went off to the Nuclear Free Conference in Fiji, run by the churches of the Pacific, basically, and she persuaded them to turn right around and add the word independent. There was, up until that time, it was Nuclear Free Pacific, and Titiwhai went there because she immediately understood that the atomic bomb was it wasn't bad news, it was absolutely catastrophic news. And that's why she went there, but she functioned there to bring out the question of indigeneity and the independence of Pacific peoples in all their diversity. And that was accomplished much to the discomfort of many of the white people there, including people like John Hinchcliffe, who's one of my closest friends. And John had to learn about that because Te Whai was one of the most helpful people he found in AUT eventually. So he had to do all sorts of somersaults as well as I had. But also Te Whai immediately opened up the way for the younger bunch of Haukiat Harawira, for the younger bunch to go to Hawaii and pull the global indigenous movement towards Aotearoa, New Zealand, and welcome onto the marae at Holy Sepulchre. And then I got tangled up with that. And I was learning by leaps and bounds at that stage, but I wasn't very happy because it felt like we're doing everything by the skin of our teeth. And so on. I knew there was plenty of money in Europe, but it wasn't very easy to get at. I tried my hand at it. I wasn't very successful. But I did get a bit, and we had a bit of money ourselves, Jocelyn and I. So I spent some of our own money helping people. If someone got stuck in the middle of the Pacific without an airfare, I'd just have to send it off.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. But I knew what was important by then. And yeah.
So you called the Springbok tour a civil war of the spirit. You know, this fight over apartheid, and at the time most of New Zealand was in favour of the tour, right? And now retrospectively no one supported it, but at the time I remember too, most people were in favour, and a civil war of the spirit. I think, you know, in the time since then, we're in 2025, certainly feels like those words might apply to the world we're living in at the moment. And, you know, there's actual war, there's terrible Gaza, there's Ukraine, there's parts of Africa, there's just endless war as usual, and the military-industrial complex are fueling it, and all those dynamics which never seem to go away. But this civil war of the spirit, what do you see ahead of us? What do we need to do? Like, I mean, as people of Aotearoa, have you got words of wisdom for us for the challenges we're facing and where we might be going?
A lot of the time nowadays, I read a lot of stuff, of course, some very good stuff, including your stuff, and I feel out of my depth. And then I think, out of my depths, that's the right place to be, actually, because there isn't any depth to all this. And even that Pākehā anthem, Anchor Me, and that all the New Zealanders and the London pubs would sing together when they got together. And that's got a sort of feeling about it that links us with Shakespeare and company, as well as with the Pacific, and as well as with an ocean. And there's something about a peace squadron, there's something about the Mairoa protest, and there's something about the extraordinary fact that you not only had a peace squadron before its time up there against the testing by the French, you had a New Zealand frigate there, and then another New Zealand frigate. And when the New Hebrides was made independent, the New Zealand sent a frigate to take the new Prime Minister around the islands, because it was really dangerous, really dangerous place for a while there. I was in and out of there like a yo-yo for a while, and trying to just give some moral support, if nothing else. My friendship and my membership of the ruling family, as it were, turned out to be the Prime Minister. So it was a very strange experience. But I think something like that. Muldoon used the armed forces against his own people who had elected him. He used the armed forces against them at Takaparawa, Bastion Point, at the Springbok tour. The guys who marched me off the field, they weren't policemen, they were army officers. And the guys who flew some of the helicopters, they were Air Force helicopters that tipped over the yachts out there in the Peace Squadron. But so there's some strange possibility of the instruments of government being not at war with their electorate, but actually finding themselves in cahoots with them. You know, and we could see that in the leadership that was being offered by Norman Kirk, for example, and to some extent, quite an extent, by David Longy. You know, there's all of that texture in New Zealand. We've somehow got to gather it together, the whole lot, including the unbelievers, you know, and there's some pretty nasty people out there, obviously. Or not just nasty, they've got a completely different mindset, and it's not just a mindset, it's quite a deep-seated belief. And you've got such an extraordinary thing as Bishop Tamaki. But somehow or other, all of this has got to be helped to move into, and we're just starting, and all that we've done so far is sort of just starting. A lot of my colleagues get pessimistic, almost despairing, and I won't have a bar of that, because I've seen things come and go. I've seen Muldoon come and go, long before Trump came and is about to go sometime. I don't know what for them. But of course a civil war of the spirit usually has quite a lot of violence to it. And will America really want to go back and make itself great again by repeating the kind of violence that they suffered in that terrible civil war they had way back? You know, I think it's possible that we could gather ourselves together, come to our senses, catch up with ourselves. It's got a lot to do with language. That's why I'm so fascinated by Te Reo and the concept that Maori have, that their own language is a living, breathing reality. And I know I haven't learned Maori. To me, that has never quite seemed a number one thing. I might be wrong about that.
Kia ora, George.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think it's beautiful. Like, we shouldn't succumb to our pessimism, to our doubts, to our fears. You know, we should, and that we've just begun this weaving. It's a beautiful, beautiful idea. And we're coming towards Christmas. We're at that time of year, the uber consumerism of the year, but also that most powerful message. And in the times we're living in, you know, can you share a bit of what should Christmas mean for us in these times that we're living in?
Well, if we could see it, we could see that it's all happened before. All of our modern history, you can find replicated or there in the history as it lies there in the Hebrew scriptures of the Old Testament, and in Christianity's own sacred literature in the New Testament. It's all there, and it's there in the sort of Exodus, in a sense. Jesus is pictured in the contemporary scriptures. Jesus is pictured as going down to Egypt, but in order to be born, he had to go down to Bethlehem at the order of the pharaohs. The Roman Empire required everybody to be counted, the census, and much as it was resisted by local peoples, they all had to go back to their own point of origin to be counted. So Jesus goes down there to be born at the command of the pharaohs, and when he gets there, there's there's only kind of a stable for him to be born in, and if you start to read our own Christian scriptures, as this man helps us to do, for example, Horsley, The Message in the Kingdom. I return to this book time and time again because Horsley, as a Christian theologian, worked with a Jewish archaeologist, Neil Silverman, and the two of them wrote this book, which brought the reality of Palestine close in, of Jesus' Palestine, the reality of it close in to the religious version, and it brings it in with the commercial version of Christmas. And they don't fit at all really very well. But the Hebrew version is there. And the Christian sort of scriptures are there. There's your book, which the history of the Maori converts to Christianity in New Zealand. There's your account of that, which is great stuff. And my fellow Pākehā they might have dipped into it a bit, but they haven't read it with the attention that they must give to it.
Thank you.
I don't know that they will just because I say so. They'll figure it out some way or other. It'll happen. And it's all happened before because all the migration things are going on. People are being shunted here, there, and the next place. They're trying to get to a better life, and they're being trapped. And we can see it all happen. Muldoon was a great blessing to us because we could see his fascism, and and he called me fascist. Well, he's down in my biography as calling me that. I've never seen that before. He was always quite relatively cordial towards me, not cordial. And now Americans can see it in Trump. Only Trump's got it. All his associates have got it all very highly organised. So if we look at Jesus, he's on his way, and his being born into the world, because the wise men weren't all that wise, they went and talked to the guy who was already king of the Jews. Yeah. And they wanted to know, where is the king of Jews going to be born? Well, the king of the Jews was not very pleased with that. Herod immediately sort of sent out, and then one of Herod's sons continued the process. And, of course, Herod built the temple. And so the temple's involved in this, and the contemporary Jewish structure, which was supported and sustained by Herod, the king of the Jews, was all in opposition to Jesus. But the Jewish people themselves, before Zionism anyway, although I think probably Zionism always was there within the Hebrew tribes, the Hebrews understood themselves as a tribal people. They began as tribal peoples. They began as indigenous peoples way back there. And they got out of slavery. At first they had to go into slavery and then they got out of it, and Jesus goes down and then he's brought back to Samaria where he lives. And when he was a boy, later on, he could go up the road to this Sebaste. It was a town that had been renamed and turned into one of Herod's glorious cities, which was a centre for tax collection. And Jesus must have known all about that. And so, there's all sorts of political tones within the Christian scriptures, which, the liberal Christian scholars, even some of the best of them, just completely, they either miss it or they ignore it. And yet it's the real meaning, and the real meaning in one sense, of what was actually happening. And so it's all happened before, and we'd do well to try to get the hang of that. I don't say that the commercial Christmas is all bad or anything. I took Jocelyn in to meet Santa Claus in Remuera, of all places. We didn't know what we were letting ourselves in for. And we came away with a cowbell and a picture of Jesus and I sitting with Santa Claus and with one of his angels. And the two angels had told me that I saw the two angels were outside persuading people to go in to meet Santa Claus. And I said, what are you dressed up like this for? What's going on? They said, we're taking photos and stuff. And I couldn't get, and they talked about a grotto, but I didn't take much notice. And I said, I'll bring Jocelyn back later on and we'll see what we can do. So we came back and they ushered in, and we found ourselves in the presence of Santa Claus, who'd been set up by the big real estate firm that has its headquarters in England, but it's got its headquarters in Remuera as well, of course, because the great migration of the rich is happening as well. So I don't want to knock, but even someone as radical as Mitzi Nairn, who was a wonderful Pākehā woman, and she said, George, she knew that we, years ago, were organising a Thin Santa campaign, which was very good, a story in itself. But we had this Thin Santa going around shaking hands with the Fat Santas and trying to get it into the public eye to raise the question about this Santa Claus and the prosperity gospel and stuff. And we only got a certain distance with that. Well, just my delight at sort of being in touch with you again, and who knows, you just get this enormous thump from the church, and you picked yourself up and you're still going, immediately. And I wanted to know, it's not my business to know all details, stuff like that, ecclesial stuff, but none of my business in a way, but not the details. But I can see, in general, I see what's happening is you don't seem to have waited even 3 days to be resurrected. You've got out, you've moved the stone aside yourself, and out you've come. And you've been met by people who really admire you and value you and all that. And here we are doing the latest thing in communication. Part of the story of how we gather the whole Aotearoa New Zealand together and all the other people who've come to make their home here. Yeah.
Kia ora, George, thank you. It's a beautiful compliment and a beautiful vision to finish with. You shared before you're 94 and, you know, you haven't wasted a day of your life, from what I can see. And it's inspiring to listen to you today and inspiring to think about this message as we do come into the Christmas season. And, yeah, we're full of fear, full of doubts, I think, and you bring a message of hope. So, nō reira e te karaua, e te rangatira, a tēnei te mihi atu ki a koe, ki o mai rangatira. Tēnā koe. Thank you, George. It's a great honour to have you here today. So, kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you very much.
Kia ora.